This is Brian Kemple of Continuum Philosophical Insight. Today we're going to take 15 minutes to talk about the meaning of the word objective. If you want to know more about me, who I am, and the work I do, take a look at the links below. Today's topic is the third of four related videos I'll be doing. First, I talked about modernism, postmodernism, and how we got into the mess of today. Second, I talked about the meaning of truth. And finally, next week, I'll be trying to give a quick explanation of semiotics. Now, the word language is at times used in a confusing manner because its signification is confused. Sometimes we are indicating the species, specifically human capacity to express semantic depth pertaining to a being known as independent of our cognitive activity. In other words, we are indicating the ability to signify things as they are in themselves and not merely as they are referred to our pragmatic considerations. We can call this the linguistic capacity for the sake of clarity. Other times, however, when we speak about language, we are talking about a specific system of signs used for such a purpose. We can safely call such systems languages or specific languages. Every specific language is composed of words, which are conventional signifiers. That is, there is no necessary correlation between the sounds I make with my mouth or the words I write on the page and the objects that they signify. Thus, two distinct words can signify one and the same thing, as dog in English and Hund in German both signify the same species of animal. But the sound snarglish might just as well signify that very same species, dogs. And by kind of stipulation, I can say that that is what snarglish signifies. If other people start using snarglish in this way, the signification changes from being by stipulation to being by custom. Customary significations tend to become stuck in the minds of those who use them, especially when it becomes a sort of transgenerational custom. Thus, if I started using the word dog to signify a pile of leaves, there would be both confusion and resistance. Nevertheless, the meanings of words, the objects they are used to signify, do change, grow, become clearer, shift, dim, or fall into obscurity, and so on, depending upon how the customs change. That said, and already by saying it we've broached the topic of semiotics, that said, while the signification ascribed to any particular word is conventional, the specific languages we use are languages at all, that is, they are instances of our linguistic capacity, insofar as the words constituting the language immediately and proximately signify the concepts of our mind. While the words of the specific language are conventional, the significations belonging to the concepts are not. Thus it is that sometimes the changes in how words are used allow us to better signify and explain the significations of our concepts. Symbols, Charles Peirce said, and words are the preeminent kind of symbol. Symbols grow. The word sign, for instance, has grown considerably since its early use in ancient Greece, which in Greek rather than English was semeion, used initially to signify the symptoms of a medical condition. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in history next week. But we can likely think of many other words which have grown over the course of history. Community, for one, or truth, as I discussed last week. That is, a growth which is not necessarily an increase of the term's comprehension, but perhaps a deepening, strengthening, or clarification of its meaning. Other times, however, the changes result in a concept no longer being signified at all, such that the concept experiences a societal atrophy, or other changes stemming from a lack of careful philosophical reflection on how terms are used, might result in some confusion of concepts, that is, a blending together of two things which are really different as though they are the same. And I think a little of each has happened with the word objective. Now here we have to note that objective has two other forms commonly used today, namely object and objectivity. Both object and objective have quite frequently some sort of equivocal use, for both are used at times to signify a goal or an aim, as when we talk about a mission objective, or in the sentence, she has always been the object of his affections. And this latter is closely related to the grammatical use, right? Where we talk about direct and indirect objects of verbs. In academic discourse generally, however, the terms object, objectivity, and objective have a common signification as pertaining to reality in a cognition-independent dimension. Thus, the term object is commonly used as a synonym for thing. Objectivity is used to signify an absence of vested interest in the outcome of a situation, and objective is used to reference things as they are quote-unquote factually, scientifically, or independent of any subjective interpretation or opinion. Thus we have people striving to demonstrate their objectivity in disputed matters and to prove their claims as objectively true. Now, when it is said that we are treating another human being as a mere object, this indicates a diminution of their status from person to thing for use, which is kind of another issue altogether, since there's a kind of weird, depreciated, almost perverse sense of the aforementioned equivocal meaning of object as pertaining to a goal or aim in such a use. Nonetheless, none of these words in their contemporary usages signifies the same concept that the word object originally signified, or rather, in which the Latin word objectum signified. This Latin word objectum was composed from two parts: a preposition ob, meaning against, and iactum, a perfect passive participle form of the verb iacere, meaning to throw. Thus, the objectum was that which was thrown against. Thrown against what? To the Latin philosophers, against some power or faculty belonging to a subject. That is, to be an object for the Latin age philosophers was something precisely and only insofar as it was in relation to some power, and most especially a cognitive power. Noticeably, there is a remnant of this understanding in the equivocal meaning of object as pertaining to a goal or an aim, but this is a very weak remnant compared to the full force of the original sense. For being in relation to a power can occur in different ways, and I'll not go into them here for the sake of brevity, except to say that the potential relativity, the potential relations between subject and object, or power and object, is far more complicated than simply between an agent and its goal or its aim. Now, in Latin antiquity, subjective and objective were not opposites, as meaning, respectively, what belongs to the opinion of an individual mind, and what is true regardless of what any individual person thinks. But rather they were a correlative pair. The objectum was thrown against the cognitive faculties or powers of the subjectum, and it was by the faculties of the subject that the thing was an object at all. That is to say, that everything having existence is a subject, but only subjects with psyches, or cognitive powers, can have objects, properly speaking. Or to put it otherwise, ontologically speaking, everything is in itself subjective, and becomes objective only by relation to a cognitive agent. And it's a little funny to think about, because that's pretty much the precise opposite of how we use the words today. But it's only a little funny, because this loss of the original meaning and the rise of the new have had two profoundly negative consequences. First, the idea of objective knowledge, or of objective truth, is a pretty skewed one. Truth, the revelation of what is and the subsequent adequation of thought and thing, unfolds through interpretive means. That is, the adequation is not a simple one-to-one ratio of matching something in your mind to something in the world, but requires a deliberate effort. It requires us to inquire into what really is, since very often we are mistaken. Our concepts, which are the means through which this adequation occurs, are not dropped into our heads as perfect, precise means, but must be worked out through various operations. And it is never the case that we get the full, unblemished, absolute truth about the objects those concepts signify. Our concepts, in other words, are never perfect signs. They may be sufficient, adequate, and accurate, but never perfect. Our intellects are so weak, Aquinas says, that we can never perfectly know the essence of even a single fly. Second, the original concept signified by objectum, the intelligible thing precisely as it is in relation to a cognitive power, is not sufficiently signified by any other term or succinct phrase of the English language. And just as a little aside, there's something comparable in the etymology of the German word Gegenstand. But their language, too, has suffered the same sort of confusion. And sometimes you find Gegenstand and object in German being used in various ways and sort of being used in the same way. And in both cases, it ends up in the same way that it's happened in English. At any rate, it's difficult to make known just how incredibly important the concept signified by objectum is. The objects of our thought are not always the same as the things themselves, and without a clear possession of this concept in the first place, it's hard for people to grasp that, I think, in many ways. That is, our concepts may present to us objects which differ from the things they include, either by being more limited than those things, which is almost always the case, or by including in their signification to us certain aspects which are outside those things themselves. To give some brief examples, I saw a picture the other day of the dumpy tree frog, or it was White's Australian tree frog. Both my concept, signifying the kind of creature, which is the essence of such frogs, and my percept or mental image, composed from particular experiences of such tree frogs, are extremely thin. Really, I only have one picture in mind, and almost no specific knowledge about the frog beyond what I know about all frogs, and even that isn't very rich knowledge. I can't say I know an awful lot about frogs. Thus, the frog as an object of my cognitive action is much less than the frog as a thing. On the other hand, in seeing any bulbous, dumpy-looking frog, because of the cultural exposure I have had in my life, I immediately think of the frog not just as an animal, but as one that sits on lily pads, hops around small ponds, perhaps retrieves a golden ball, and gets kissed by princesses. The first two being things that follow from its nature, but which are nevertheless relational and therefore somehow extrinsic to what they are in and of themselves, and the last two being fictional relations. Since I know they're fictional, I'm not deceived, but a young child might be and might think that those are things that are proper to frogs. Regardless, these relations, both the ones which follow from its nature and the ones that are fictional, signify something more than the frog itself, signify the frog in a context. And something very similar to this relational conceptualization happens in most of our experiences. Certainly in every experience of culturally shaped socialization. That is, every object we encounter which has something in it that does not belong to it, strictly on account of its own nature, is an object expanded beyond the boundaries of what is presented by the thing in itself. For instance, friends, lovers, teachers, judges, police officers, and so on. That is, there might be a basis for there being such objects, as some people make better friends than others because of how they are in themselves, because of their attributes as individuals. But being such an object entails something more than just that basis. In conclusion, our concepts may signify an object as an expression of what is intrinsic to a thing, or it may include extrinsic significations as well. These extrinsic significations can be good or bad, true or false. They may be ampliative to our understanding and increase it, or they may be detrimental to our understanding, misleading us. And to understand this more fully, we'll need to dive into semiotics, so tune in next week. Thank you for your time, for listening, for thoughtful consideration, for any subscriptions that you might happen to make, and I'll see you soon.